Okay, welcome to the second video on direct proportion. By the end of this video, you should be able to solve some more complicated direct proportion questions. And if you're thinking, I don't know how to solve a simple direct proportion question, you should already have watched the first video on direct proportion. So if you haven't done that already, maybe you need to go back and watch that first, otherwise today's video won't make very much sense. So let's have a quick recap of what we already should know about direct proportion. Firstly, we met this proportionality symbol yesterday or in the video whenever you last watched it, and it looks like a fish and it means is directly proportional to. And we always start these proportionality questions by writing a proportionality statement using this symbol. Once we've done that, we turn it into an equation by replacing that symbol with an equals k, so that we have an equation. And before we do anything else after that, we need to know what k is, and there's always some information in the question that will allow you to go and find out what that is. Once you've done that, you must remember to rewrite that equation with the k replaced by the number you just found. It just makes the whole of the rest of the question go an awful lot better. And once you've got that equation, the rest of the question should be relatively straightforward, because you're simply then replacing numbers into an equation you already know. So let's have a look at the types of question we might need to solve in this video. This question here says, if y is directly proportional to the square of x and x is 25 when y is 4, then firstly we're going to find an equation relating y and x, very similar to the last video, sketch the graph, find y when x is 12 and find x when y is 10. So hopefully most of that question feels familiar. It's very, very similar to the stuff we've already done. This is the only bit that makes it harder, because rather than y being directly proportional to x, today it says y is directly proportional to the square of x. So I need to just remember to deal with that when I'm writing all my statements. So how do we start? Well, first we need a proportionality statement. So I'm going to write y is proportional to, now today it's not just x, but the square of x. So here I'm going to write x squared. Then I'm going to proceed as I did before and replace that symbol with equals k. So now I have an equation that says y equals k x squared. And remember, the objective now is to find out what k is, so that I've got an equation that I can use for the rest of the question. So somewhere in the question is some information that will allow me to find out what k is. So y is 4 when x is 25. Now don't forget that squared. That still needs to be there. It doesn't go anywhere because this says x squared, so this needs to say 25 squared. Okay, now I need to find k, so to do that I'm just going to work out what 25 squared is. That's 625, so this really says 4 equals k times 625. I want to get the k on its own, so I'm going to divide by 625. Leaves the k on its own here, and over here I'm just going to write it as a fraction because it's not a very nice number, and rather than have a rounded decimal it's way better just to leave it as a fraction. So I've written my proportionality statement, I've turned it into an equation, and I've now found k. The next thing I need to remember to do is to take this equation that I had up here and rewrite it with the k in the right place. So now it says, and remember, I'm just leaving that as a fraction, y equals whatever that number is multiplied by x squared. And there's my equation that now allows me to do the whole of the rest of the question. Okay, so I've found an equation relating y and x. Next up, I need to sketch the graph. Well, we've just done a whole load of stuff on graphs that look like this. If it's got an x squared in it, hopefully you know that that graph is one of those very particular parabola shapes that looks a bit like a U. And there's nothing added on at the end, and that tells me that it goes through 0, 0. So when they ask me to sketch the graph, because it's an x squared graph, I'm going to sketch that parabola shape. It goes through 0, 0, and I know that because there's nothing added on past the x squared. So that's A. Both of those bits done. Next up it says find y when x is 12. So just like before, just like the easier questions, for each of these bits I'm going to write down the equation. So the equation says y equals 4 over 625 x squared, and the question says find y when x is 12. So I'm going to put 12 in here and use that to find y. So just move it down so that you can see it. Reinsert the multiplication sign, because I've got rid of the algebra now. And don't forget to keep the squared, because that doesn't go anywhere, that's still there. So what have I done? I've put the 12 in there instead of the x, and so the rest of it is exactly the same. Next up, grab my calculator, 4/625, and I need to multiply that by 12 squared. You can do that in 2 bits if you want, or your calculator's pretty clever, it will do it all in one go. So I have 576/625, and I can either leave that as a fraction, or if they want it as a decimal, press the SD button and write it as a decimal, whichever they've asked for. If they haven't asked, then either will be fine. So what did I do? I looked to find y when x is 12, so I rewrote the equation. I put the 12 in instead of the x, and then all in one go I stuck that in my calculator. If you prefer, you can work out the 12 squared first and then multiply it. For part C, I'm going to find x when y is 10. So start with the equation. Sub in the y value they gave me. And now I need to just be a little bit more careful, because I've got to find x, and the first thing I need to do is get rid of this fraction at the front here. So this at the moment is multiplied by x squared, so the opposite of multiplying by 4/625 is to divide by 4/625. And my calculator will just do that for me. In fact, let me make it do it so I don't have to write too many lines. So I am literally just going to ask it to do 10 divided by that fraction. And that gives me 1562.5. And on this side, remember, I've still got x squared. Okay, I've got rid of the 4/625 by dividing, but I've still got x squared left. And so hopefully you should know that if I know what x squared is and I want to find x, then I need to just square root both sides so that I can get rid of that squaring. Okay, so now I'm going to square root that number, and that gives me 39.53, and I've rounded that to 2 decimal places. Okay. So same principle as yesterday. I still write my proportionality statement. I still turn it into an equation with a k in it. I still put the numbers in, and I still find k and then rewrite the equation. It's just that the equation is a little bit more complicated. We're going to do one more example together, and then you're going to practice some. So let's have a look at this one next. Get it into shot for you. Okay, so if p is directly proportional to the cube root of q, and p is 7 when q is 8, find an equation, you know how they go by now, and then find p when I've got q, find q when I've got p. So, number 1, let's write a proportionality statement in algebra. P directly proportional to the cube root of q. And you need to read these questions really carefully so you make sure you pick up the right information from the question, because it's not cubing it, it's the cube root. So I need to put q inside a cube root. And that looks crazy and it looks complicated, but actually the principle is still the same as before. Firstly, replace it with an equals k. Now I'm going to leave my multiplication sign in this time because it's a bit more complicated algebra, just to make it a little bit clearer. Now sub in the information I know and use that to find k. So p is 7 when q is 8. P is 7 and q is 8. Now either you will know what the cube root of 8 is and you can just write it down, or if not, you can ask your calculator. There's a button on mine, it's just here, just above the square root symbol. It might be above your cube symbol, you need to find it. I happen to know the cube root of 8 because 2 cubed makes 8, so therefore I'm just going to write 2 in here. And then I want to find out what k is, so I'm going to get rid of that multiplied by 2. And you can either write it as a fraction, 7/2, or in this case it's quite a nice decimal, it's 3.5, so I'm going to write it as 3.5. Now, just before I forget, don't forget, this bit here needs rewriting with your k value in. So p equals 3.5 times the cube root of q. Okay, so all I've done there is put my k value into the equation. Next up, I've done part A, I've found the equation, but now I need to do B and C, and to do that each time I'm going to start with that equation and fill the numbers in. So 3.5 times the cube root of Q. Well, this time they've told me that Q is 64. So I'm going to put in the cube root of 64. And again, if you don't know that, you can ask your calculator. If you do know it, you can just write it down. Okay, so I've asked, make sure you press the cube root, not the square root button. So I've asked my calculator for the cube root of 64, and hopefully you can see that that's 4. So that gives me 3.5 times 4, which I think is 14. No, 16. I'll just check. No, it is 14. Don't know what I pressed there. Okay, so 3.5 times 4, which is 14, because 4 was the cube root of 64 on that line. For part C, find Q when P is 10. So rewrite the equation. This time P is 10, so put the 10 in instead of the P. Get rid of this multiplying by 3.5, so I need to divide by 3.5. And I'm going to ask my calculator to do that for me, because that's not very nice. And it's given me a fraction, it's given me 20 over 7, so I'm just going to leave it as 20 over 7. It's not a very nice number. And now I need to think about what the opposite of cube rooting is. So if I've cubed rooted something, I think the opposite is to cube it. And so I'm going to cube both sides. And on the right hand side, that obviously just gets rid of that cube root. And on the left hand side, I need to cube this. Now again, you should have a button that allows you to cube it, but if you can't find it, just press, I can't find mine, so I'm just going to use the power button and raise it to the power 3. And this time I'll give an answer, so I'm going to go 23.32. So apart from the fact that the first statement will be more complicated and therefore you set up a slightly more complicated equation, the steps that you go through are identical to the simple proportion questions that we've already practiced. Okay, so there's 2 examples and hopefully you're good to have a practice now.